Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The bodies have been buried. The shooting, for now at least, has stilled. But the reverberations of the killings in Paris are far from being played out.
In France, more than 100 attacks on Muslims and their properties have been reported. Well, not reported by the mainstream media, if you know what I mean. There has been mayhem in Belgium, and the head of British Security Service says it's almost inevitable that a similar disaster is on its way to us.
We appear locked in an intractable conflict. We can go blindly forwards, or we can embrace the dictum that when you're in a hole, the first thing you should do is stop digging. Joining us now to reflect on this is one of the world's leading Muslim analysts and its most eloquent spokesman, the head of the Cordoba Foundation, Altakriti. Anas, welcome back to the Sputnik. It is still reverberating, isn't it? The Charlie Hebdo magazine is about to be published and sold in Britain with inevitable protests. I myself addressed a mass rally in Bradford last weekend, making the point that whilst we utterly condemn the harming, let alone the killing of anyone for anything they've said, written, drawn, these are provocations. These are not cartoons. These are obscene and pornographic representations of a prophet held dear by almost 2 billion people in the world. It's asking for trouble.
Well, George, first of all, Gayatri, thank you very much for inviting me back on the programme. You're absolutely right. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, since when did Europe measure its progress, civility, liberty and development on the basis of its capacity and aptitude to hurl, insult and offend others? And plus, it's a mirage. Free speech is a lie. When at the very rally, the 1.5 million march in Paris to condemn those atrocious attacks, called the Freedom of Speech rally, when the BBC correspondent there couldn't even dare ask a question without being reprimanded and forced to apologise. I mean, the irony is stark. It's not about freedom of speech. It's here, I mean, we're talking about something that unfortunately we have totally lost control over, and that is how we behave ourselves. I mean, we thought it was exclusive to the political class. We thought that only politicians can talk about democracy while supporting dictatorships, can talk about human rights while exercising torture, can talk about liberty and freedom while censoring. We thought it was only exclusive to politicians. It seems that actually societies as a whole are led by a media narrative that tells them to behave in a particular way, that it's okay or not okay to do or say. And unfortunately today, you sort of forget exactly what it is that we're fighting for. As societies, what do we stand for anymore? When your measure of freedom is, you know, your ability to actually offend, insult the most sacred figures and icons of 3 million people who live amongst you, whom you live amongst, who share your neighborhoods, who share the marketplace from which you shop, who share the restaurants, you know, from at which you eat, and so on and so forth. It's quite disgusting, the level of vitriol that actually guides us. And I fear what we're calling on is more and more divisions, more and more apprehension,
fear,
probably. Well, fear, and probably even out of those millions will appear again a handful of idiots who choose to take things in their own hands and seek vengeance, which everyone condemns. But ultimately, you'll have to say, listen, if you poke someone in the eye once too many, you have to expect a response.
Well, the security service have made that clear, that it's almost inevitable. That this is their words, that something like this is going to happen in Britain. And the former head of the security services, Sawyer, said that these cartoons are a provocation. But you Go on.
Well, Charlie Hebdo sells itself as a satirical magazine. In the UK, we've also got a similar satire magazine called The Private Eye. Do you think it's in the same league?
Not at all. I mean, Private Eye is a publication. If you go decades back, it has a long-standing tradition in poking fun at politicians, in expressing people's own bewilderment with the way that politicians are acting, with the political class, with the kind of silly and stupid statements that politicians get. I mean, it's a totally different thing. This is directed towards Muslims everywhere around the world.
Muslims and black people. This cannot be forgotten. Hebdo's caricaturing of black people is utterly racist, whether they're Muslim
Wasn't it the French minister, the black French minister, whom they depicted as an ape?
They depicted her as an ape. The girls in Nigeria who were kidnapped were caricatured as welfare queens with pregnant bellies, saying, when do I get my benefits, and so on. This is a racist, hypocritical, scurrilous magazine with one agenda only, to attack the already marginalized, to attack the already vulnerable and weak, rather than the real job of a satirist, which I would argue is what Private Eye does, of holding the powerful and the rich to account. Absolutely. We've got the front page here, which sums it up perfectly. There's that march in Paris to which you referred. Je suis charlatan, they're saying. We are charlatans. You were too kind to them. Netanyahu was at the front of the march. He killed 17 journalists in Gaza just last summer. The Saudi ambassador was at the front of the march. They're flogging people for blogging. The Prime Minister and President of several African countries who routinely jail and worse journalists, and yet there they are marching for freedom.
We have a problem, and that problem is that now, whilst hypocrisy was it was something that was quite a shameful label to carry.
Yes.
It seems that now people don't really mind it, and don't really mind showing that they don't mind it. I mean, the people there, people who actually have blood on their hands, arriving at a scene where people are supposedly talking about the freedom of speech. I mean, most of the people leading that particular line were people who wouldn't allow, or in fact, actively close down areas and spaces for people to express themselves. So being there is as though I'm, sending a message. I'm not only going to oppress you, I'm going to sort of celebrate being here while suppressing you. I don't even care about being accused of oppressing you anymore. And that is where I think we have a real problem. And my hope was, and I have to say that sectors of the media have behaved incredibly responsibly. And, the responses to some of the idiotic statements and tweets made by people like Rupert Murdoch, like Steve Emerson of late, who spoke of Birmingham as being an entirely Muslim city.
He hounded me for many decades as a terrorism expert, and he thought that Birmingham, United Kingdom, was
a no-go area for non-Muslims. I mean, these people. When they spoke, the massive response that came from non-Muslims to them. The way that J.K. Rowling, for instance, said, if I have to be responsible for Rupert Murdoch, the way that he held the entire Muslim community responsible for those criminals in France, then, I'm sorry. It's amazing.
Let's go deeper, because time is short. This is located in the so-called war on terror, the invasion and occupation of one Arab and Muslim country after another. These things don't come out of thin air. Western countries like ours, like the United States, and France latterly, have been deeply implicated in the invasion, occupation of Arab countries, Muslim countries, in the buttressing of dictatorships in other Muslim countries against their people. And the motivation of these lunatics, these criminals who did all this in Paris, was itself born out of that. They told us so in their videos. Are we locked into this constant war, and is it going to get worse?
Well, unless we change our ways, George. I mean, in your introduction, you said it. I mean, now, what, 13, 14 years on, year on year, if we were to believe everything the intelligence services tell us, things are getting worse. More and more recruits, more and more sympathise to the terrorist cause. You know, more and more attacks are being fought. That's what they tell us, at least. We don't know the reality. So if we're to believe that, it means that for the past 13 years, year on year, there has been a failure. But no one is brave enough to stand up and say, hang on, we've got it wrong, we must think in a different way. I mean, I think it was the former French Prime Minister, de Villepin, a brilliant politician, someone whom I have immense regard, because he was with us, remember, at the time of the war in Iraq, and his opposition.
The dignity of his speech,
and the way in which he spoke, while still the smoke was churning out of those places in Paris, and he said, you know, this isn't the fault of Islam, it's the fault of Western policies going absolutely berserk and creating, you know, anomalies such as ISIS and others in the Middle East. Someone like him needs to be heard more. It's actually the fact that these people, first of all, they are products of Europe, not of some Muslim country. In fact, in that particular scene, the product of a Muslim country was the guy who protected the Jews in the kosher shop and led them to safety, to save their lives. That was the product of a Muslim land, Mali. Otherwise, the killers, if we again are to believe who they are and their backgrounds, they're products of British societies, of French societies, of European societies. Why blame Islam? Most Muslims around the world don't behave that way. Most Muslims around the world, whilst being grossly offended by Charlie Hebdo, never went and attacked anyone haphazardly in the street. Never. In fact, only a couple of days ago, I was having this debate with a local councillor who was very, very much against, you know, the presence of Muslims in our locality. I said to him, listen, there are hundreds of thousands of British expats who live, work, and spend their entire lives in Muslim countries. Wouldn't it be easy if that were the tendency, the DNA, the intrinsic, you know, instinctive reaction of Muslims to basically set upon those people within the Muslim community who he believed, you know, believed in Sharia law and believed in attacking all non-Muslims? Wouldn't that be the case? But we never hear of that, simply because Muslims are not so inclined. And we need to understand that these people weren't radicalized because of a passage they read in the Quran or something they heard of the Prophet. It was because they saw images of Abu Ghraib. It was because of the stories they heard coming out from Guantanamo. It was because they heard that their own government had committed atrocities in various countries, including Muslim countries, and they became in the way that they did. That's no justification, but we need to understand how this is created, and we need to understand that unless we change course, this might happen again.
Final word, literally 10 seconds. What's your view on Chilcot being postponed?
I think it's because it'll cost in the coming election. I think that truth hasn't been found. I think truth wasn't even sought at some stage. That's no condemnation of Lord Chilcot himself, but the whole inquiry and its remit, I don't think it really wanted to get to the bottom of what happened in 2003, which may turn out to be, and I think it is, the crime of our time.
I told you he was eloquent. Anas Altakriti, thank you very much.
Thank you
for joining us. Coming up after the break, he's been an internee, a convicted political prisoner, the founder of a world-class festival, written poetry, plays, political tracts, newspapers, and now the relaunch and much improved edition of his novel, West Belfast. He's Danny Morrison, and he's up on the Sputnik next. Welcome back to Sputnik. Danny Morrison is an iconic figure in the long struggle for Irish unity and independence from Britain. He spent years behind bars as a political prisoner.
Like so many thousands of others, of course. One difference is that while prison was a university for all Republican prisoners, for Danny Morrison it was a gateway to his current role as a Renaissance man.
He's a poet, a playwright, an author, a journalist, a propagandist for his cause without peer. And with the revised and reissued West Belfast, again, a novelist of what we now call the Troubles. And he joins us now. Danny Morrison, welcome on board the Sputnik. Let me say it is a brilliant novel.
Thank you.
Touching, beautifully observed, troubling, of course, disturbing. And you wrote it 25 years ago.
That's right.
But this is effectively now being launched. In fact, its official launch is next week.
Next Thursday.
25 years is a long time. between writing and launching. Explain why.
Well, when it was published 25 years ago, within a couple of weeks I was arrested and charged with conspiracy to murder and kidnapping and IRA membership, and was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment for that, although that has subsequently been overturned. I was set up by a British agent, a man under the name of Steak Knife was his code name. So that has been overturned, and I'm currently suing the British government for wrongful arrest. So in actual fact, this next Thursday is the official launch of West Belfast. My publisher decided to reissue it to celebrate the fact that it was 25 years old. And when I went back looking at it, I realised, oh my God, it was full of purple prose and too many adjectives and adverbs. And I decided to cut a lot out. So I cut about 15,000 words out, but I ended up putting about 5,000 words in. The same story, same plot, but the nationalist community, what it was like for them, a peaceful community that tried peaceful means to get their civil rights, and of course they were suppressed and beaten into the ground. So it covers all of the major events in the early days: civil rights movement, the pogroms of 1969, false curfew, and of course internment and Bloody Sunday. And it covers that period, and it shows you how a peaceful community, a section of it, could move towards supporting an armed struggle.
Well, the characterisation, I remember, although Scotland and West Belfast are quite different places in many respects, the lives of working class people were very similar.
Sunday Post.
Sunday Post was even in the novel. Your mother in her apron, not taking her apron off until quite late in the evening, signalling that her day is done and so on. The faith, then quite common in working class communities. You and I are both quite good propagandists. It's easy for us to write political tracts. It's very much more difficult to write a novel, and I don't know that I could do it. You get the dialogue beautifully. Did you find that difficult?
Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, I always wanted to be a writer, and when the Troubles broke out, I remember the first time I bought a typewriter to write poetry and to write novels, but the first letter that I wrote was a letter to our local paper, the Irish News, protesting against the shooting dead of William Halligan by the British Army on the Falls Road. So there's always this split between, you know, what I wanted to do. I ended up, whatever, I suppose, purported talent I had towards explaining things. I devoted myself to the Republican cause for 25, 30 years. I was in prison when the ceasefire was called, and this novel had just been published before my arrest. I wrote 2 more books in prison, and when I came out, the peace process was underway. And I had a conversation with my friend and comrade Jerry Adams, who supported me in going down this road. So I've carved out a literary career, but I still keep my hand in. I'm still much interested in commentating on what is going on, and not just in Ireland, but of course internationally.
Well, of course, there's a very important new turn in Irish-British relations, which is in a way foretold in your book in the interrogation scene. Tell us about that.
Well, when I was researching the book, I interviewed 3 of the men, the hooded men. These were people who were arrested during internment week in 1971. They were brought away to a secret interrogation centre. They were subjected to beatings, white noise, mock executions, were thrown out of helicopters, forced to run over glass, were deprived of food and water for up to 10 days. They were dressed, and this is where it's amazing, you know, when history repeats itself, almost in Guantanamo-like. They had hoods on for those 8 to 9 days, and they were dressed in one outfit and an overall, and they were forced to stand against a wall. Now, the Irish government took the British government to the European Court on torture allegations back in 1971, and of course the British government denied these allegations. But recently, as a result of work by the human rights organisation, the Pat Finucane Centre, and Pat Finucane, of course, was a human rights lawyer whom Britain was involved in assassinating with loyalists, the Pat Finucane Centre came across this letter at Kew Gardens, buried along with thousands of other documents, showing Merlin Rees, who was then the Secretary of State, writing to James Callaghan, who was then the Labour Prime Minister, stating that the government had cleared the torture and that Lord Carrington himself, Ministry of Defence, had cleared, and this is why their people they had to defend the police and the soldiers involved. And as a result of this, he uses the word torture. And as a result of this document being found by the Pat Finucane Centre, the Irish government 4 weeks ago has reinstated the torture case in European court. So Britain is now once again in the dock for what it did in Ireland.
Well, Pat Finucane's son has been on this show, and Lord Carrington's still alive, you know.
He's 95. And he's still alive, and Merlin Rees, in an official letter, although a letter that was of course hidden from the public, states that Lord Carrington and the British government, and by the way, Merlin Rees also says, I spoke to the late Brian Faulkner about this, and he confirms this. And Brian Faulkner was of course the Prime Minister at Stormont, who was in charge whenever internment was introduced. With devastating effect, because you had a massacre in Ballymurphy as the paratroopers were making arrests. They killed many people, including a priest and a mother.
We've had the filmmaker who's made the film Ballymurphy also on the show. Now, without ever accusing or asking you to acknowledge that you've ever held a sword, the pen in your case is definitely mightier than the sword, isn't it? Because even British cabinet ministers, like Michael Portillo, go and see your plays and mark them 10 out of 10 in their literary criticism. Did you learn this during your time in prison? Or did you feel you had a nascent talent, you got the typewriter when you were young? How much of a part did prison play in your flowering as a literary figure?
Oh, well, I mean, as I said earlier, I always wanted to be a writer, and I kept diaries in 1968 right up until I was a Republican activist in 1972, when I could no longer keep diaries. And I've been in prison 4 times. The last time I was in prison, I really got down to reading and catching up on all the works, you know, like the Russian and German literature, world literature that I had missed out on. So I was always practicing my writing, and I suppose in writing speeches for people, in making speeches and doing interviews. I was also the editor of Sinn Féin's national newspaper for many years, and I was the national director of publicity for Sinn Féin for 11 years during a hectic period in the late 70s and throughout the 1980s. So I see now I'm a great-grandfather. I'm still interested in politics, but my main interest is in writing works which are worthy of the community. There's always going to be a political element to it. I mean, one of my books which I wrote in prison was about a gay postman, and loyalist prisoners in the jail were, you know, slagging me and shouting abuse at me because of that. Another one of my books, The Wrong Man, was written from an informer's point of view, sympathetic portrayal of an informer, which some of my comrades in the Republican movement found a bit strange, given the fact that myself and others had been sentenced to, well, between us, about 100 years in jail on the word of a British agent.
One of the most honourable things about your preface to the reissued West Belfast is your acknowledgement that you may have wrongly caricatured your opponents, enemies, because of a lack of knowledge, a lack of interface. In the 25 years since, you've learned more about the people on the other side, if you like, of the wall. Was that difficult to do and acknowledge?
Well, of course, as a result of the peace process and as a result of the movement towards reconciliation, I've met and have become friends with a lot of people who were, you know, characterised as former enemies, including former IUC men, former British soldiers, and former unionist politicians. And I think this is the importance of talking and engagement is you know, it's so clear to me. I mean, the irony of the British government released Gerry Adams from internment in 1972, flew him and other leaders in an RAF plane to come to London for talks at a time when he had no mandate. And then when he gets elected, they ban him from entering Britain and they introduce the Broadcasting Act. You've got all of these ironies. So the importance, and I think it's it's a position I would hold internationally, regardless of how the temptation to demonise the enemy, it's always important to talk. It's the most important thing, I think, in terms of peace building, is to always engage in talks. And I think this is applicable right across the world, particularly in the Middle East.
Danny, this will make a cracking film. Have you had any offers yet?
No, I acted, well, the Wrong Man, the play, was, people were interested in making the film of it, but then, like all of these things, they go through phases. One year it's going to be a gangster movie, the next year it's going to be an escape movie. So hopefully, we'll see. Maybe you've got some contacts.
Well, I do have one or two filmic contacts. I'll send it over to Sean Penn. Danny Morrison, thanks for coming on the Sputnik.
Thank you both.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, I asked the people to reflect on the Paris attacks and, for example, the march that took place in Paris right after it. And Hannah Slade responds, well, when you invite Israeli and Arab leaders to a Paris march focusing on peace and free speech, you've either got a dark sense of humor or you're mad.
Very well put.
And Earthian says, false flags to garner support for more bankers and wars. Profit over people. Well, that's it for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can keep in touch with us on Twitter, RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.